Hey guys, for today's video I'll be going over the brand new V1 beta leaks for 3.7 that include Cyrene's Kits, Lightcone, and Eidolons. I'll also be going over the new Planner sets, the new Lightcone for RMC, and the new ability that RMC got, all while explaining the implications that all of this information has for Honkai Star Realm. Also, because this information comes from the V1 beta, keep in mind that all of this information is subject to change, and probably will change throughout the upcoming betas, so take everything with a grain of salt. Starting off with their kits, Cyrene is going to be an ice HP scaling remembrance character similarly to Evernight, but unlike Evernight, she's not going to show Castorice, but rather she's gonna be the best generalist supports for all Crisis heirs, and is going to be a powerful generalist for other characters. For her basic attack, it states that Cyrene gains 1 recollection point, which is her ultimate stacks, and she deals ice damage equal to 50% of Cyrene's max HP to 1 designated enemy target. So already we can see that she scales off of HP, and that she's gonna be broken because it seems even her basic attack is good for collecting stacks. For her skill, it states that Cyrene gains 3 recollection points and deploys a zone that lasts for 2 turns, with the zone's duration decreasing by 1 at the start of Cyrene's turn, similarly to Tribbie's or Jiaochosa's zone, and not like Castorice or Phainon's domain. This distinction is important because forcing a domain as a support character would make that support character have anti-synergy with Castorice, Phainon, and other future domain-having characters. It also states that while the zone is active, damage dealt by all allied targets deals 1 additional instance of 20% true damage, and when Cyrene is downed, the zone will also be dispelled. Okay, so this skill is how we all expected it to be. It's gonna be like RMC's true damage buff, but on steroids. You see, even though RMC can give up to a 48% true damage buff, depending on how much energy the carry has, Cyrene being able to provide what is later revealed to be a permanent 20% true damage buff when she uses her ultimate for the whole team is actually insane, and is already putting her on par with Cipher, one of the best AoE supports in the game. For her ultimate, it states that Cyrene summons Memo Sprites blank, which I'm assuming is being blanked because of some story spoilers. Then it causes the Memo Sprite to immediately gain 1 extra turn and activates all of her teammates' ultimates. Already, this is insane. This ultimate is going to be insane for pretty much any support, and it's going to be especially insane for characters that heavily depend on their ultimates and characters that generate ultimate energy through unconventional methods like Acheron, Fei Chao, Castorice, and Phainon, since this ultimate doesn't replenish ultimate energy, but instead it simply activates their ultimate. It also states that she enters the ripples of past reverie states, which enhances her basic attack and only lets her use this enhanced basic attack. This enhanced basic attack states that Cyrene gains 3 recollection points and deals ice damage equal to 30% of Cyrene's max HP to 1 designated enemy, then deals ice damage equal to 30% of Cyrene's max HP to all enemies, and it cannot recover skill points. This is a pretty basic enhanced basic attack that seems to do mediocre amounts of DPS and generates a good amount of stacks for her ultimate. Her ultimate also states that Cyrene's and her unknown Memo Sprite's crit rate is increased by 50%, and she deploys the zone effect from the skill with no active duration, aka no cooldown. Okay, so this is actually insane, not only because she gets a 50% crit rate increase similarly to Jingliu, but because this crit rate boost is seemingly permanent, along with the zone as well. This permanence is made even more obvious since her ultimate also states that her ultimate can only be used once per combat, implying that there's no need to use it again because the effects are permanent. It also states that the Memo Sprite's initial HP equals to 100% of Cyrene's max HP, which is pretty good since most Memo Sprites, even HP scaling ones, typically only have 50% of their summoner's max HP. Also, even though this isn't stated in the description yet, after looking at some leaks, it seems like when using her ultimate, you have the ability to either buff your allies with a special Memo Sprite skill, which I'll go over in a bit, it, or you can do a really powerful attack. For her talents, it states that when combat begins, or after Cyrene takes action, teammates and their memo sprites gain Future. When ally targets with Future take action, they consume Future to grant Cyrene 1 recollection points, which is going to be extremely good for generating stacks. And when Cyrene has 24 recollection points, then that's when her ultimate can be activated, meaning that her ultimate can only be activated after a couple of rotations rather than at the very beginning of the game, since it's not feasible to gain this amount of recollection points that fast. It also states that when she has 12 recollection points while in the ripples of past reverie states, aka while she's in her ultimate states, then you can reuse her ultimate. Also, after looking at some leaks, it seems like her ultimate can only be used once you reach 24 recollection points, but it only consumes 12 recollection points when you use it, meaning that you can use her ultimate twice to either attack enemies or buff allies. It also states that after reaching the maximum amount of recollection points can overflow to a maximum of 27 points, which means that once you reach enough recollection points to use her ultimate, you can only do one more skill or enhanced basic attack before wasting recollection points. And finally, it also states that while Cyrene is on the field, she increases damage dealt by all ally targets by 20%, which is a really good damage dealt buff considering its permanence. For her major traits, it states that when a teammate's memo sprite is summoned, it too gains Future, and Future held by memo sprites cannot be consumed, meaning that ally memo sprites can also generate more recollection points for Cyrene's ultimates when taking action, which synergizes really well with Aglaea because her memo sprite takes a lot of actions, and it obviously synergizes really well with Castorice's premium team, since Hyacine, Evernight, and Castorice all have memo sprites. For her other major traits, it states that when there are 1, 2, or 3 Crisis Heirs, or Remembrance Path characters, aside from Cyrene, in the team, Cyrene gains 2, 3, or 6 recollection points at the start of combats, meaning that you're gonna want a team full of Crisis Heirs or Remembrance characters on your team for you to get her ultimate far quicker than usual. For her other major traits, it states that when Cyrene's speed is at 180 or higher, she increases all allies' damage dealt by 20%, which is really good since now she just straight up gives a permanent 40% damage dealt increase. It also states that for each point of speed exceeding past 180, she increases Cyrene and her memo sprite's Ice Rasp Pen by 2%, counting up to a maximum of 60 exceeded speed points, and thus a maximum of 120% Ice Rasp Pen. That, let's be honest, will not be achievable for most people, but if you can achieve it, this Ice Rasp Pen is going to be insane, since Rasp Pen gets accelerated returns once you go past 0% of an enemy's resistance, which 120% Ice Rasp Pen will definitely be able to do since most enemies only have around 20% to 60% res. Anyways, now that we're done with all of that, now it's time to get into the real good stuff, aka her memo sprite abilities. For her memo sprite talents, it states that her memo sprite speed remains at 0 and will not appear on the action order, unlike Evernight's or Castorice's memo sprites. It also states that while on the field, it is considered as out of bound, meaning that it cannot be selected by allies nor enemies. And when changes occur on Cyrene's HP percentage, the memo sprite's HP percentage will also change accordingly, which I'm hoping will generate new buff for Castorice and stacks for Jingliu. Also, when the memo sprite is on the field, Cyrene's and the memo sprite's max HP increases by 24%, and after using abilities, all continuous effects duration on this unit decreases by 1, similarly to Tribbie or Ruanmei's ultimate duration. It also states that when the memo sprite is summoned, it dispels crowd control debuffs from all allies, which is definitely nice because this means that Cyrene has a cleanse in every action that summons her memo sprites. Okay, so these pretty standard memo sprite descriptions are ironically pretty odd and honestly pretty confusing. After looking at some leaks, it seems like Cyrene's memo sprite is literally just herself, and so because of this, I'm assuming that her memo sprite only takes action when she takes action, or when she gives her memo sprites a quote-unquote extra turn, which would visually just look as if she herself is just getting an extra turn, since she is her own memo sprite. But I'm not too sure about this, so if any of y'all know the actual answer to this, feel free to correct me in the comments. Anyways, for her Mamosprite skill, she deals ice damage to all enemies equal to 50% of her Mamosprite's max HP, which is just your standard ice damage HP scaling Mamosprite's basic skill, similarly to Evernight's standard ice damage HP scaling Mamosprite basic skill. But her other Mamosprite skill is what's actually insane. Also, even though it doesn't state how to activate this Mamosprite skill, after looking at some leaks, I think you activate it after using her ultimates. It applies a buff to one designated ally, and when the target is a Crisis Heir, the target gains a special effect. But when the target is not a Crisis Heir, it increases the target's damage dealt by 40% for 2 turns, which is a pretty good damage dealt buff, especially when combined with the 40% damage dealt buff that she gives with her talents and her trace. But this isn't what makes this Mamosprite skill so good, but rather it's the former half that gives an incredibly powerful special effect that is unique to each and every Crisis Heir. So because there's a lot of special buffs, aka 14, I'll just go down the list of special buffs to see what she does for each and every one of the Crisis Heirs. For RMC, Cyrene's Mamosprite skill is effective for the entire battle. It states that when used on RMC, she increases RMC's attack by a value equal to 16% of her Mamosprite's max HP, and she increases RMC's crit rate by a value equal to 60% of her Mamosprite's crit rates, and this effect also applies to Mem. This is going to be a really good attack boost that'll increase RMC's sub DPS by a ton, and what I think is a 30% crit rate boost, since Cyrene's Mamosprite's crit rate is going to be 50% because of Cyrene's ultimate, is a really good crit rate boost that synergizes well with all of the crit damage that RMC wants to have. It also states that after RMC uses their enhanced basic attack in this battle, Cyrene's Mamosprite immediately gains 1 extra turn and automatically uses walls of flowers and arrows, which is the quote-unquote basic Mamosprite skill that I mentioned prior to talking about this skill. It also states that if the target was defeated before this ability is used, it will be used on newly appeared enemy targets instead, which is nice because this means that your Mamosprite skill damage won't be wasted. For Aglaea, the special effect is a one-time effect, which I'm assuming means that it's not a permanent effect like RMC, but rather an effect that you have to keep refreshing. It states that when used on Aglaea, it causes Aglaea to gain Romantic, and immediately stacks Garment Maker's Mamosprite talent's speed boost effect to its max, which is really good because this means that you won't have to waste a ton of time trying to ramp up Aglaea's damage. It also states that after Aglaea or Garment Maker uses an attack, they consume Romantic and regenerate 70 energy for this unit, which is enough energy to solve Aglaea's energy problems, and because of that, this will make her sustaining slot a bit more flexible, allowing you to use Danheng PT instead of Woho, for example, which is nice since Danheng PT synergizes a lot more with Aglaea's speed than Woho does. It also states that the special effect increases the damage dealt by Aglaea and Garment Maker by 72% and ignores 36% of the target's defense, lasting until Aglaea exits the Supreme Stance state, aka after her ultimate ends. These amplifying effects are actually insane, since the damage dealt is ridiculously massive, and the defense shred is pretty good by itself since it will result in a 23% DPS increase, but if it's being paired up with someone like E1 Sunday, aka a pretty cheap vertical investment option on a character that is always going to be paired up with Aglaea, well then that DPS increase increases to a 93% DPS increase. So as a fellow Aglaea enjoyer, I can definitely say that these buffs did not disappoint, since they amplify her damage tremendously, reduce the monotonous ramp up, synergize with her best supports, and fix her energy issues. For Tribbie, this one is a lot more straightforward, and it's also effective for the entire battle. It states that when used on Tribbie, it causes damage dealt by Tribbie to ignore 12% of the enemy's defense, which is good if you're using another character on your team that also decreases defense, since defense shred's damage increase is increased with the more defense shred and defense ignore that you stack. But if you're not, then this amount of defense shred is pretty negligible, since it'll only result in a 6-7 DPS increase. It also states that when Tribbie launches a follow-up attack and triggers the additional damage from Tribbie's own, it further deals 1 instance of additional damage, which is a decent boost boost to her sub DPS, but it isn't anything substantial, since this one additional increase, aka a 100% damage increase to her additional instance of damage, only happens when using her follow-up attack, not when other allies attack, which is where the majority of her sub DPS comes from. Now, unless I'm reading this wrong, since it does say when Tribbie launches a follow-up attack and triggers the additional damage from Tribbie's own, meaning that it does actually double her additional instances of damage for other allies, and it triples her instances of damage, but for her follow-up attack exclusively, then this special effect is actually insane for her sub DPS and quite possibly broken. But if that isn't correct, then the special effect is kinda meh, with its only redeeming quality being the fact that it'll permanently help Tribbie do decent amounts of front-loaded damage rather than constantly having your Cyrene pretty much waste her ultimate buffs on Tribbie just so that she can do really mediocre amounts of front-loaded damage. For Mydei, the special effect is another one-time effect similarly to Aglaea. It states that when Mydei is in the Vendetta state, he automatically uses Godslayer Be God. In this attack, Mydei's crit damage is increased by 60%, and this usage does not consume charge, which is pretty good since generating charge can be a hassle sometimes, and the 60% crit damage synergizes really well with the insane amount of crit rate he already gets. It also states that if he is not in the Vendetta state, then it advances Mydei's action by 100%. This special effect is really good and will be good enough to replace Sunday with Cyrene and Mydei's best teams, since the crit damage she provides is pretty close to Sunday's crit damage, and the automatic free Godslayer will be God is leaks better than a regular 100% advance forward from Sunday. For Castorice, the special effect is effective for the entire battle. It states that when used on Castorice, New Bud can overflow up to 200%, and it increases the damage dealt by 0.24% for every 1% of overflow value consumed when the summoned Netherwing triggers the ability effect of its talents Wings Sweep the Ruins, which is just the bounce damage from when Netherwing explodes. This means that you can increase the damage dealt of her ultimate's bounce damage by up to 24%, which is pretty good since I'm pretty sure you'll consistently be able to get this maximum amount of overflow New Bud, but even then, as of right now, this damage dealt is kinda mid. It also states that if there are 2 enemy targets on the field or fewer, the damage multiplier additionally increases by 0.48%, aka you can get an additional maximum damage dealt boost of 48%, which is actually insane. This additional damage dealt boost is even crazier when you consider the fact that bounce damage is far better against fewer enemies, which is the only way you can get this damage boost, meaning that you can either do up to 24% more bounce damage to 5 enemies, which is good I guess, or you can do up to 72% more bounce damage up to 2 or fewer enemies, which will obliterate the HP bar of both enemies. So the special effect is definitely conditional, since you need to get the maximum amount of overflow New Bud, and you need to be facing off against 2 or fewer enemies to make the most out of it. But if you can manage to make the most out of it, then Castorice's damage will skyrocket. For Anaxa, this special effect is a one-time effect. It states that when used on Anaxa, it recovers 1 skill point for the team and causes Anaxa's next action to advance by 100%, which is good because Anaxa would typically be very skill point negative, since he wants to spam as many skills as possible, and it synergizes really well with the advance forward by 100%, because you kinda need a skill point to make sure you're not wasting that 100% advance forward, which is similar to what the GOAT aka Sunday does with his ultimate enhanced skill. It also states that it increases Anaxa's skill damage by 40%, increases his attack by 60%, and that increases the number of instances of skill damage by 3, lasting for 1 turn. These amplifying effects are obviously really powerful and will synergize well with Dan Heng PT since that attack percentage looks really good. But obviously the most important aspect of the special buff is the additional skill damage, because this means that his damage will simply be increased by 50% independent of any other amplifying effects when you use Cyrene's enhanced Mem Sprite skill on him. And when paired with Cerydra, bro will actually do 6 instances of damage if you can time Cyrene's enhanced Mem Sprite skill and his Barrage states, which definitely explains why he didn't get a more detailed and longer animation like Castorice did for his additional skills. Now, the only bad thing about this buff is is that it only lasts for one turn, meaning that the 60% attack boost can't fully synergize with Dan Heng PT or Cerydra's skill copy unless you time things perfectly, which, similarly to Saber, having to time really crucial buffs can definitely make Anaxa harder to play. For Hyacine, it states that when the Memosprite skill is used at all, it causes Hyacine to gain 2 stacks of a poem about Sky, and it regenerates 24 energy for Hyacine, which is nice since you typically need to waste at least 1 skill points so that Hyacine can have a 100% uptime on her ultimate. But this energy will definitely alleviate that concern to an extent, since this amount of energy is near perfectly enough energy to solve that issue. This is because after using her ultimate, she gets 5 energy, Little Ika's follow-up attacks generate 15 energy, and Hyacine's basic attacks generate 80 energy by the time she has to use her next ultimate, which equates to 100 energy. But with an ERR rope, it'll now equate to around 119 energy. So if you give Hyacine 24 more energy, she'll now have 143 energy out of her 140 energy ultimate cost, meaning that she'll have her ultimate up 100% of the time. It also states that when Hyacine has a poem about Sky and is providing healing, it additionally increases the healing value for Little Ika's Memosprite skill by an amount equal to 72% of the healing value this time, which I know it's a skill, but I'm assuming it's talking about Little Ika's talents that heals your allies, since Little Ika doesn't have a skill that heals allies, in which case this will definitely sustain your team enough and generate enough new bud to not have to use another skill before using Hyacine's ultimate. It also states that after Hyacine uses her skill/ultimate, she consumes 1 stack of a poem about Sky, which, even though this description doesn't state that this ability is a one-time use, the fact that the stacks can be consumed and the special effect generates energy similarly to Aglaea's special effect, it makes me think that this is a one-time effect that you'll have to replenish similarly like with Aglaea. Anyways, these buffs are definitely powerful with Hyacine since they solve her energy problems and they increase her passive healing by an enormous amount. For Cipher, this special effect is effective for the entire battle. It states that when used on Cipher, it increases the damage dealt by Cipher by 36%, which will be good for her sub DPS that generates a lot more true damage, and it also decreases the defense of the Patron by 20% and the defense of enemy targets other than the Patron by 12%. As you probably already know, this defense shred is going to be really good, especially when paired up with other forms of defense shred or defense ignore, since the damage increase of defense shred increases with the more defense shred or defense ignore you stack, and because Cipher, unlike other characters, actually synergizes really well with a lot of other defense shred sources like Nihility Lightcones, Sundays' E1, Silverwolf, Pella, Anaxa, or Sparkles' E2, well then this defense shred is actually really good and will amplify her carry's damage significantly. This is because this 20% defense shred can be the difference between a 72% DPS increase and a 110% DPS increase, which may not seem like a lot, but when you consider the fact that this 110% more DPS is being further amplified by a true damage buff and a vulnerability debuff, which synergizes as well with defense shred as damage dealt synergizes with attack, or crit rate synergizes with crit damage, well then now that difference is definitely far greater and will result in even more DPS. For Phainon, his special effect is effective for the entire battle. It states that Phainon gains Eternal Ignition when transforming, and while Eternal Ignition persists, it increases Castellanus' crit rate by 16%, which is pretty nice since this crit rate boost synergizes with the 30% crit damage that he gets. It also states that after Castellanus' extra turns are depleted, the transformation does not end, but refreshes all of Castellanus' extra turns instead, which is exactly what that leak stated, by the way, and it's also just as insane as we thought this ability would have been. It also states that Castellana loses HP equal to 15% of his current HP for every extra turn, which is revolutionary for Phainon teams, since this lets sustainless Phainon be undoubtedly the best way to play him, which is really good since sustained teams are far more comfy than sustainless. It also states that after using an attack, he deals 5 instances of additional damage, with each instance of damage dealing fire damage equal to 30% of Castorce's attack to one random enemy. Okay, so 2 things. 1, his current HP being depleted kinda sucks for Sustainless, and this will definitely make Sustain Phainon a better option than Sustainless, because being able to sustain Phainon for way more departed actions will be better than a bit more buffs from someone like Bronya. And 2, yeah, sure, him doing 6 additional instances of fire damage lets him do a bit more damage, but what's really important about this is that it's a super cool detail that fits his lore. Anyways, these buffs will definitely make Phainon incredibly powerful by allowing him to do more actions and giving more value to his sustaining teams, while not destroying the concept of his kits and adding a really cool detail in the process. For Hysilens, this special effect is going to be a one-time effect. It states that Hysilens gains Flowing Warmth, and after Hysilens uses an attack, she consumes Flowing Warmth and regenerates 60 energy, which will be really good since her entire kit revolves around her ultimate. It also states that in this battle, it increases the damage dealt by Hysilens by 100%, which is good because this synergizes with Kafka's major trace that provides 90% attack, but because she already gets 90% damage dealt from her base kits, this amount of damage dealt is a bit oversaturated. It also states that after Hysilens uses her basic attack or skill to attack enemies, she causes the dots currently applied on the attacked enemy targets to immediately produce damage equal to 60% or 80% of the original damage, which is actually insane, since this is literally the best ability any dot character could have. Now, I don't think that this special effect will make it so that Cyrene will replace Kafka in dot teams, since Kafka's own ability to do the exact same thing is far better than whatever Black Swan, Robin, Cipher, or Tribbie could bring to the table. But this ability definitely makes it so that you can replace Kafka in a dot team and have that team remain viable. Thus, if you don't have Kafka, pull for Cyrene, and if you do have Kafka, still pull for Cyrene because this buff is busted for dot teams. For Cerydra, this special effect is going to be effective for the entire battle. It states that it increases the crit damage of the character with military merit by 30%, which is really mediocre since all of her synergies already have a ton of crit damage. It also states that after Coup de Main ends, Cerydra immediately gains 1 point of charge, which is really good since it'll guarantee that Anaxa can do 4 skills every other turn without needing to spend skill points on Cerydra's skill. And if you do spend skill points on Cerydra's skill and use her ultimates, well then, let me tell you, you're gonna get way more skills with the special buff, especially when combined with Anaxa's special buff. And for Phainon, this extra charge means that when you enter his departed states at max charge stacks, aka at 8 charge stacks, you'll be able to do a third meteor. So this special effect is really good since it can save you a skill points with Anaxa or increase his skills by a ton. And it allows Phainon to do a third meteor. For Evernight, this special buff is going to be effective for the entire battle. It states that it increases the damage dealt when Eevee uses the Memo Sprite skill Dream Dissolving as Dew by 48%, which is a pretty good amount of damage dealt, but it's not anything insane. It also states that after Evernight uses her skill or ultimate, she additionally gains 1 point of Memoria, which is also only decent because she mostly gains Memoria from Memo Sprites attacking or from allies taking damage, and she doesn't even gain an additional Memoria for every Memoria gained, which would have been insane since this would have doubled her Memoria regeneration. Instead, she simply gets 1 more Memoria when she uses her ultimate or skill, which isn't anything too impactful. So this special effect is pretty mid, with the only redeeming quality being the fact that it's permanent. For Heng, Permansor Terrae, it states that if the Memo Sprite skill is used at all, similarly to Hyacine, it increases the damage dealt by Heng's bondmate by 16% lasting for 2 turns, which is a pretty good damage dealt buff because it synergizes with the fact that the bondmate typically wants to have a lot of attack for Heng's Soul Dragon to do more additional damage. It also states that the next 3 attacks of Soul Dragon deal additional damage of corresponding type equal to 80% of the bondmate's shield effect, which is definitely interesting because the Soul Dragon typically does damage based on the bondmate's attack, which allows Dan Heng to have amazing synergy with Phainon, Cerydra, Anaxa, and any other future unit with a ton of attack. But this time, it only lets him do more damage based on what is his typical maximum of 4500 shield effect, meaning that his sub DPS will not increase with the more powerful the bondmate is. But his sub DPS will definitely increase by a good portion, since the special effect would be pretty equivalent to the bondmate getting 3000 attack out of nowhere. It also states that when the skill is used on Dan Heng, it will additionally advance the Soul Dragon's action by 100%, enhance the Soul Dragon's action, and it will increase the shield multiplier provided by the Soul Dragon by 150%, meaning that the Soul Dragon will be able to immediately do one more enhanced Soul Dragon action and provide a shield equal to 22.5% of Dan Heng's attack rather than a shield equal to 15% of Dan Heng's attack, which is definitely a way better buff for Dan Heng's sub DPS than the additional damage based on the bondmate's shield effect. That'll help the Soul Dragon do more additional damage because the Soul Dragon now does additional damage based on the bondmate's shield effect. Also, it states that this enhanced Soul Dragon action does not consume the enhancement charge of Dan Heng's ultimates, which just cements the fact that Dan Heng will be able to have 3 rather than 2 Soul Dragon actions, which will drastically improve his DPS, especially if he has his E2, since his E2 will increase his DPS by an additional 4% for every additional Soul Dragon action over the standard 4 Soul Dragon actions per cycle. For Cyrene, I think she can enhance herself, since the name for the skill is quote-unquote a poem about blank, which is similar to the wording of every other special buff for the other Crisis heirs. It states that after Cyrene has gained recollection from each different teammate other than her Memosprites, when her Memosprite uses wads of flowers and arrows, aka her Memosprite's basic Memosprite skill, it additionally deals 1 instance of ice damage equal to 50% of its max HP to 1 random enemy, which is definitely really mediocre and was probably only added for the sake of being added. Okay, so after 5300-ish words later, I'll finally go over the next section of this video, aka her Lightcone. For her Lightcone, it states that it increases the wearer's speed by 18%, which will be really good for trying to get that additional Ice Rest pen. It also states that when the wearer's Memosprite uses a Memosprite skill on an ally, they gain blank, which increases the damage taken by all enemies by 10%. This damage taken increase is kinda mid, since Tribbie and Evernight do the same thing, but double. It also states that when the wearer's Memosprite uses a Memosprite skill on an enemy, they gain Verse, which increases crit damage of all allies by 16%, which is a decent crit damage buff. It also states that when the wearer's Memosprite has both blank and Verse, it increases the effects of blank and Verse by 120%, meaning that the damage taken increase will be increased to 22%, and the crit damage will be increased to 35% crit damage, which practically makes this Lightcone an entire Harmony unit on its own. Now, because the requirement to get blank requires you to use a Memosprite skill on an ally, the maximum potential of this Lightcone can only be used by Cyrene and RMC, since they're the only remembrance units that can use a Memosprite skill on both an ally and an enemy. Thus, even though this powerful Lightcone can be used by 2 powerful supports, it's a bit mediocre if you plan on using it for numerous characters, and in comparison to other investments like Evernight's E1, Sunday's E1, or Hyacine's S1, this Lightcone is arguably worse, since this crit damage buff and damage taken buff isn't anything revolutionary. Still, considering that she is replacing Tribbie and even Sunday in a lot of teams, this Lightcone will be good for replacing the damage taken increase that Tribbie provides and all of the crit damage that Sunday provides. For her Eidolons, her E1 states that after using her ultimate or when her Memosprite is summoned, her Memosprite gains 1 story points, and when story reaches 3 points, her Memosprite consumes all story points, immediately gains 1 extra turn, automatically uses her basic Memosprite skill, and gains 3 recollection points. This means that after using her ultimate or after her Memosprite is summoned 3 times, her Memosprite will do their basic Memosprite skill and regenerate 3 recollection points, which is pretty mid since it's not like you'll be spamming Cyrene's ultimates or constantly summoning her Memosprites. Not only that, but although 3 recollection points is pretty good, it's not that big of a deal unless they're being spammed, which they're not. It also states that it additionally increases the number of bounces for the Memosprite skill that targets herself by 12. Resolve, which increases the multipliers from 50% of her max HP to 650% of her max HP, which would result in an insane amount of damage. For her E2, it states that when entering combat, she additionally gains 12 recollection points, half of the amount needed for her insane ultimate. It also states that for each different ally character that gains the Memo Sprite skill buff from her Memo Sprites, aka the buff from her ultimate, the damage multiplier of the true damage dealt by all ally targets via the skillset zone increases by 5% up to a max increase of 20%, which means that now Cyrene's true damage buff isn't just a slightly better Cipher buff, but now it's a slightly worse RMC buff but for all allies, which makes this E2 actually broken and probably one of the best E2s in the game. For her E4, it states that each time after her Memo Sprite uses her basic Memo Sprite skill, the damage multiplier of the triggered Memo Sprite skill, a poem about blank, aka the attack that Cyrene does when she targets herself with her Memo Sprite skill, is increased by 5% in the current battle, which is really mediocre since even though this does have some really good potential for, I don't know, simulated universe, the damage increase in this attack is really small, and it won't amount to anything important in endgame content. For her E6, it states that when Cyrene uses her ultimate for the first time, all allies' actions advance by 100%, which is literally just Robin's ultimate, which you can use with Robin for potentially some of the best zero cycles. It also states that each time her Memo Sprite triggers her E1 and uses walls of flowers and arrows, aka the basic Memo Sprite skill, based on the number of times it has been triggered, allies gain the following effects. After one time, it increases all ally targets' all-type rest pen by 12%, and after 2 times and more, it advances all allies' actions by 20%, which pretty much just means that after the first time you use it, you get a permanent 12% all-type rest pen buff, and every time after you use it once, you get a slightly worse Tribbie Lightcone effect, which is actually insanely powerful since you'll pretty much be activating this effect every time Cyrene takes a turn with her 180 plus speed, which is way more frequent than when a Harmony unit does their ultimate. So technically this effect is actually better than the Tribbie Lightcone. For RMC's new joint attack, it states that after using their ultimate, they gain 1 stack of Epic, up to 2 stacks, and when Mem is on the field and this unit has Epic, their basic attack is enhanced to Together Write the Shape of Tomorrow. Then they consume 1 stack of Epic to dispel all crowd control debuffs on Mem, which is pretty good since this will let the joint attack actually activate, and it can help you get a true damage buff right when you need it. It also states that the Trailblazer and Mem then launch a joint attack, and individually deal ice damage equal to 200% of the Trailblazer's attack and 200% of Mem's attack to all enemies, which is pretty good sub DPS. Then Mem gains 10 charge, which is nice for their true damage buff. For the new Planars, one of these Planars is pretty nice, with the other one being really conditional, obviously biased, and powerful. For the first Planar, aka the Amphorius Planar, it increases the wearer's crit rate by 8%, which is standard. It also states that while the wearer's Mem Sprite is on the field, it increases all allies' speed by 8%, and this effect cannot be stacked. This Planar is pretty good for a lot of characters, since the crit rate is standard and the 8% speed is nice for speed tuning characters, really good for Aglaea, and really good for Cyrene, since 8% speed could potentially get you 16% ice rest pen. For the other Planar, aka the Tengoku Planar, it increases the wearer's crit damage by 16%, which again is pretty standard. It also states that if 3 or more skill points are consumed in the same turn, it additionally increases the wearer's crit damage by 32% for 3 turns, which is really good since it's double the standard. Now again, this Planar is really conditional since only a handful of units can do this, with the only actually good units that can do this being Archer. So for Archer, considering that Archer is already oversaturated with crit damage, this Planar could have definitely been better, but it's still a really good option, if not the best option, since it's better than his best option right now, aka the Rudolin Arena. For the new Lightcone, this one is specifically designed for RMC. It increases the wearer's crit damage by 24%, which allows RMC to provide even more crit damage for allies. It also states that when equipped by RMC, it increases all ally targets' damage dealt by 16%, and it increases the damage dealt by their new enhanced basic attack by 100%, which is a good damage dealt boost considering it's for all allies, and it's a really good damage dealt boost for RMC's personal damage. Okay, so for her team, teams, aka synergies, obviously Cyrene is going to synergize really well with Crisis Heirs and especially with Remembrance characters. But how exactly and how well will she synergize with other characters? Well, when it comes to the Crisis Heirs main DPS, she's going to be best in slot with Aglaea because Cyrene completely fixes her energy problems and she provides her with insane damage amplifying effects that can be permanent if Aglaea maintains 100% ultimate uptime. And because Aglaea's ultimate and buffs last for so long, this means that you'll be able to use Cyrene's special buff on Aglaea once and then spam Cyrene's special buffs on Aglaea's brand new best sustainer, aka Danhong PT, until you need to give Aglaea more energy again with Cyrene's special buff. So for Aglaea's new best team, she's still gonna want Sunday, but she's also gonna want Cyrene and Danhong PT instead of Woho, since Cyrene will already provide enough energy for Aglaea, and Aglaea's incredible speed is insane with Danhong PT, who he himself will also gain a ton more buffs from Cyrene. For Mydei, she's also gonna be best in slot with him, since even though Mydei is typically paired with two other characters that aren't even Crisis Heirs, aka Sunday and Gallagher, after Cyrene's release, he's not actually gonna want Gallagher and Sunday, but instead he's actually gonna want his other really good teammates, aka Tribbie and Hyacine. This is because Tribbie and Hyacine's synergy with Mydei and Cyrene is much more valuable than Gallagher and Sunday's synergy with Mydei and Cyrene, since Tribbie and Hyacine's really fast speed can provide Cyrene with a lot more ultimate stacks than Gallagher and Sunday. Unlike Gallagher and Sunday, they're Crisis Heirs, which means that they can fulfill Cyrene's passive and provide Cyrene with more ultimate stacks. And Cyrene can actually give Hyacine and Tribbie synergistic buffs rather than a 40% damage stealth buff, which obviously no support needs, including Gallagher and Sunday. Not only that, but Sunday's buffs for Mydei aren't even as good as Cyrene's, since all he does is give him a good amount of damage stealth, which Cyrene also gives. He advances him forward by 100%, which doesn't hold anywhere near as much value as Cyrene's free automatic Godslayer, since the free Godslayer is pretty much a free turn, except it allows Mydei to use his enhanced skill rather than just his enhanced skill, and Sunday gives Mydei a ton of crit damage, even though Mydei doesn't need it when paired with Cyrene. And assuming you'd pair Cyrene with Sunday on the same team, you'd be giving Mydei around 130% crit damage, which is way too saturated, meaning that not only can Sunday's buffs be replaced by Cyrene's buffs, but he even has a little bit of anti-synergy with her because his crit damage buffs would be oversaturated with Cyrene's crit damage buffs. Not to mention the fact that Cyrene has insane sub DPS, which Sunday has none of. And for Gallagher, well, according to Pridewinds' MLC stats, and from my own testing, Hyacine is just straight up better than Gallagher for Mydei, since Hyacine can clear MLC in 4 cycles, while Gallagher can only clear in 6 cycles. Not to mention that he literally has no synergy with Cyrene. So, for Mydei's new best team, he's gonna want Cyrene, Tribbie, and Hyacine. For Castorice, well, I feel like it's pretty obvious that Cyrene will undoubtedly replace Tribbie in a Castorice team, since Cyrene synergizes way more with Castorice, Evernight, and Hyacine. This is because Cyrene can uniquely buff Castorice, Hyacine, and Evernight, while also fulfilling Evernight's 4th Remembrance character requirements. Not only that, but Remembrance characters are able to collect far more ultimate stacks for Cyrene. So, Castorice's premium team will be the best team for collecting ultimate stacks. For Anaxa, Cyrene is also going to be the best with Anaxa because that additional skill is going to allow Anaxa to apply more interpretation stacks for the Herda, recover more energy for the Herda, recover more charges for Cerydra, advance the Soul Dragon forward by another 15%, and it'll provide Heng with more energy. Not to mention, Cyrene also provides other amplifying effects aside from that, aka the 40% damage stealth for and 60% attack buffs that are just too good to pass on. And because, similarly to Mydei, Cyrene can very easily replace Sunday's amplifying effects, while also providing unique effects to every Crisis Heir and doing a ton of sub DPS damage. Now, even though Sunday, when paired with Danhong PT, can finally provide the carry with that insanely powerful 50% additional damage stealth buff, it still pales in comparison to Cyrene's 40% skill damage buff, which matches Sunday's damage stealth buffs by the way, because she already provides a 40% damage stealth buff to all allies. Not only that, but she also provides a 60% attack buff, which has more synergy with Danhong PT and more synergy with the damage stealth buffs themselves, since you typically want a balance of damage stealth and attack percentage. Now, when it comes posts to Dongheng PT over Hyacine with Anaxa and Cyrene. I've seen some posts saying that because Cyrene's special buff to Anaxa is a one-time use, and the really good part of Dongheng PT's special buff is also a one-time use, that you'll have to break the god trio that is Anaxa, Dongheng PT, and Cerydra by replacing Dongheng PT with Hyacine. You do this because Hyacine's special buff is a permanent special buff, and will not have anti-synergy with Anaxa's one-time special buff by having Cyrene constantly have to prioritize Anaxa's special buff over Hyacine's special buff. Whereas with Dongheng PT, the good part of his special buff is a one-time special buff similarly to Anaxa, meaning that you'd have to constantly prioritize Anaxa's special buff over Dongheng's good parts of his special buff, which would create that anti-synergy, which would break the god trio. Now, do I believe this? Nah. The god trio is so insanely powerful that sacrificing Dongheng PT's really good parts of his special buff and Hyacine's special buff is definitely worth it if it means you can maintain the greatness that is the god trio. This is because even though the really good parts of Dongheng's special buff is really good, it's only really good because it increases his already really good Soul Dragon actions. And even though Hyacine's buff is also really good because it offers a guaranteed 100% ultimate uptime and a bunch of really good healing, it doesn't offer anything that's remotely close to the synergy that the god trio has with each other. This is because Hyacine's healing and permanent ultimates isn't as good as Anaxa being able to provide Dongheng PT with 36 energy and advance his Soul Dragon forward by 90% every time he does his 6 skills. And it's also not as good as the Soul Dragon being able to do significantly more damage because Anaxa's attack is being increased by Cerydra. Thus, for an Anaxa team, I still think that the god trio combined with Cyrene will be his best team. For Phainon, Cyrene will definitely be his best in slot because she lets him stay in his departed states and provides really good buffs for Cerydra. Now, the implications of their synergy are a bit more nuanced, since even though she lets him stay in his departed state longer, he'll take damage equal to 15% of his current HP for every extra turn. So, because of this, Phainon's sustainless teams will no longer reign supreme over sustain teams, since you'll definitely need a certain free 5-star sustainer, aka Dongheng PT, to actually make use of these extra turns and deal a ton more damage. Thus, Phainon's new best team would definitely include Cerydra and then Cyrene and Dongheng PT as a duo. For Hysilens, you're definitely gonna want Cyrene because she makes Hysilens the best dot character in the game, hands down. You see, before Cyrene, Hysilens and Kafka were two irreplaceable components in dot teams, to the point where you either got both of them or you didn't get either of them. But now, Cyrene's special buff allows Hysilens to do what made Kafka so great. Thus, you can replace Kafka in a Hysilens team, or better yet, you can replace your other AoE supports like Black Swan or Robin with Cyrene. Now, for your sustainer, considering that Dongheng PT works really well with characters that have a ton of attack, he can very much replace the likes of someone like Wohwo to help with Cyrene's major traits and to gain more buffs himself. For Evernight, well, it's pretty much the same as what I said in the caster section if we're talking about her sub DPS playstyle, but for her main DPS playstyle, Cyrene will still undoubtedly be better than Sunday for the same reasons that Cyrene is better than Sunday with Mydei and Anaxa. Cyrene has pretty much the exact same buffs as Sunday, since she can give a 40% damage dealt increase along with her permanent 40% damage dealt increase to Evernight's highest damage dealing attack, which would result in 8% more damage dealt than Sunday. She can also do a ton of sub DPS damage and buff other crisis errors. Not only that, but unlike Sunday, Cyrene can fulfill Evernight's need for a 4th remembrance character. Okay, so now that we're done with all of the main DPS characters, how well does she synergize with all the other support crisis errors like Tribbie, Hyacine, Cipher, Cerydra, and Dongheng PT? Well, not only is she really good with them because they're all fast enough to generate a ton of ultimate stacks, and because they're all crisis errors that can give her more ultimate stacks through her major traits, but she's also really good with them because they're really good with a lot of other characters like with Acheron. For example, Cyrene is really good with Cipher because Cyrene lets Cipher apply Defense Shred on the Patron, which lets Acheron do more damage. Cyrene is also really good with Hyacine because Cyrene lets Hyacine heal more, which lets Castorice regenerate a ton more new bud, which lets her do more damage. And Cyrene's extra charge for Cerydra can help Anaxa do more skills and can help Phainon do an extra meteor. Thus, Thus, Cyrene is good with supportive crisis airs because she amplifies what these crisis airs already do, and because she lets these crisis airs buff other characters that aren't even crisis airs, like Acheron. Now, even though I did just explain how Cyrene synergizes really well with a lot of characters, for some characters, Cyrene actually has some pretty bad synergy because she can't generate ultimate stacks fast enough for her to actually be that much better than someone like Tribbie or Sunday on some teams. Thus, if they don't end up fixing this issue in the upcoming betas, which I doubt they won't because that's a really bad issue, then Cyrene's synergy with some units may not actually be as good as their old teams with Sunday and Tribbie. Okay, so now that we've finally gone over everything these new leaks have to offer, what is the consensus? Well, for Cyrene, she's going to be a really powerful support with a lot of characters because of her really powerful sub DPS, ability to activate all ultimates, 80% damage dealt to allies who aren't even crisis heirs, and 40% damage dealt to allies that are crisis heirs, along with really powerful and unique buffs for every single one of them. Thus, she's going to be a must-have for every DPS crisis heir and a really good support for supportive crisis heirs, while being a pretty good support for every other team, since most teams nowadays use at least one crisis heir. For her Eidolons, her E1 is going to be good for her personal damage after using her Mammal Sprite skill on herself, and her E2 is going to be insanely powerful in a team full of crisis heirs. Her E4 is going to be really bad, and her E6 is going to be broken. For Cyrene's Lightcone, it's pretty good for her and RMC, but it won't be used by any other current units, and there's other better vertical investment options. For the Planars, the Tengoku Planar will be really good for Archer, Qin Shui, and Dan Heng Il. The Amphorius Planar will help a lot with speed tuning characters in a team with Cyrene. The new Lightcone made for RMC is good for their personal damage, and provides some nice amplifying buffs for their allies. For Cyrene's teams, she'll be best in slot with literally every crisis heir, and she'll buff supportive crisis heirs by allowing them to buff other characters. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything you wish to say, please leave it down in the comments below. I'll greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.